If I was to say the word prehistoric, the first image to come to most people's minds is one dominated by dinosaurs. A Mesozoic landscape in which terrible lizards rule and us lowly mammals are scurrying for the undergrowth. But our lineage did not start off as the underdogs, with mammals' ancestors actually keeping reptiles on the back foot long before this. During the Carboniferous, a battle of dominance was occurring on land between the vertebrates and the invertebrates. Whilst giant bugs are synonymous with this time, an important divergence that happened with vertebrates was the splitting of the two main groups, the diapsids, which would go on to become what would broadly be called reptiles, and the synapsids, of which the only lineage around today are the mammals. Come the start of the Permian 298.9 million years ago, however, it was the synapsids who jumped ahead and diversified into the biggest land vertebrates that the world had seen so far, with one iconic group in particular being the Gorgonopsids. Named after the mythical monsters, the most famous of which was Medusa, the Gorgonopsids were first discovered in 1876 in the Karoo unit of South Africa by the famous Richard Owen. He named this first member Gorgonops torvus, of which the clade was then named after. A quick side note, the official name for the group is Gorgonopsia, with individual members being known as Gorgonopsians. But the term Gorgonopsid is often used interchangeably, despite being an informal term technically. Subsequent findings over the years have been made in Africa, Russia, and some parts of Asia, but they're notably absent from anywhere else in the world. We will get into why soon enough. For now, what does it actually take to be a Gorgonopsid, and what made them the most dangerous and fearsome predators that the world had seen so far? Well, for the longest time, Gorgonopsids, and Permian synapsids in general, were described as mammal-like reptiles, being largely reptilian in appearance but with a few mammalian traits. But more and more information uncovered has made this term misleading, with therapsids in general being neither reptiles or mammals. Gorgonopsids' most recognizable feature is their skulls. These were long and narrow, with an almost seamless and straight line from the cranium to the end of the nasal bone, and both jaws growing deeper towards the end of the snout. These jaws came complete with mammal-like incisors and enlarged canines for tearing flesh. That's right, they were doing the whole saber-tooth killing thing 275 million years before the cats. Any teeth behind this were either highly reduced or completely absent, so the business end was all at the front, tearing flesh and nothing more. This leads us to a much more reptilian feature, that being the absence of a secondary palate. This is essentially the wall of bone separating the mouth from the nasal cavity, which is present in mammals. Now this little feature is great, as it allows us to be able to breathe whilst eating at the same time, giving us more time to chew. Gorgonopsids, however, did not do this, so those mashing molars would have been pretty redundant. Another difference in today's mammals with regards to these teeth is the fact that Gorgonopsids were actually polyphyodonts, meaning that their teeth were continuously being replaced. This does raise one question when it comes to those saber teeth though, which is about the nature of the growth itself. These teeth were proportionately long, meaning that they would have taken a much longer time to grow, which is really not ideal when they're your main tool for hunting/eating. A potential explanation put forward for this was that these grew asynchronously, with one tooth taking the brunt of the work whilst the other had a chance to grow. Gorgonopsids also appeared much more reptilian with regards to their brains and ears, being much more simple than those seen in mammals today. This reptilian mammal hybrid nature continues through the postcranial body for this group too, with a long torso and reptilian hips that show separated iliums, ischiums, and pubises. But the mammal precursion comes into play when we look at the shortened tail and limbs that were held underneath them rather than at a sprawling gait. So again, these guys did the whole pillar leg structure thing long before the dinosaurs. But given that they clearly couldn't decide between mammal or reptile, more questions have been raised about their lifestyle, including thermoregulation. Now, spoiler alert, taking a Gorgonopsid's temperature has unfortunately proved unsuccessful so far, but there are other ways that we can get clues to this. Whilst earlier synapsids were ectothermic or cold-blooded, therapsids such as Gorgonopsids seem to show features associated with a higher metabolism, not only implying a more active lifestyle, but also being the potential origins for homeothermy. The parasitical gait of this group has been pointed to as potentially showing the existence of a diaphragm, something only seen in mammals that greatly enhances ventilation for aerobic activity. This would also have kept the body further from the floor and more blood in the torso, rather than being forcefully pumped around lateral limbs, further reducing heat loss. But homeothermy, that is to say maintaining roughly the same body temperature, doesn't necessarily equate to being warm-blooded. One phenomenon seen in nature, which is often pointed to when it comes to studying extinct megafauna, is what is known as inertial homeothermy, but is more often called gigantothermy. This is essentially where megafauna are able to contain more heat with far less loss, all thanks to the fact that their surface area to volume ratio is far less owing to the square cube law. Essentially, the volume will increase at a far greater rate than the surface area, meaning that the heat has more body to travel through and comparatively less surface area to be lost on. The term gigantothermy is probably considered unfavourable scientifically because it is a little misleading, implying that only giant animals relative to us are capable of this. But this is something that is even possible for animals a little smaller than us. Now, Gorgonopsids likely had some form of homeothermy, but the question is, was this inertial homeothermy or true endothermy? If they were truly warm-blooded, this is the earliest known form of endothermy, but either way, Gorgonopsids may have shown early forms of hair, whiskers, and maybe even sweat glands, as shown potentially by the presence of foramina on the snouts. Okay, so how reptilian were the senses? Well, if we start at the front of the skull, we see that Gorgonopsids had a rather short nasal cavity, but it came complete with olfactory turbinates and the Jacobson's organ, giving them a highly developed sense of smell. When we get to the eyes, we see that, first of all, Gorgonopsids possess something seen in many of today's reptiles known as a parietal eye, which is essentially a third eye on top of the head. Now, vision isn't strictly possible through this eye, but it is an organ that is photosensitive and is connected to the pineal gland, which helps an animal regulate their circadian rhythm. The actual seeing eyes on Gorgonopsids seem to show a mixture of proportionately large or small, with genera such as Viatka being on the larger side, suggesting a nocturnal or at the very least crepuscular lifestyle, and Clelandina showcasing very small eyes, suggesting a strictly diurnal lifestyle. And this mixture seems to show that this group had a high variety of lifestyles, meaning that many of them could exist at the same time, in the same place, and still be able to coexist thanks to niche partitioning. And this goes against a theory known as the nocturnal bottleneck hypothesis, which postulates that true mammals started in the Mesozoic as purely nocturnal animals in order to avoid all of the dinosaurian predators around, and that lifestyle actually originated here, with all other nocturnality in other animals convergently evolving since then. But once again, we see that these guys did it first, setting up their descendants for their nocturnality. Moving even further back on that skull, we also see another precursor to a feature championed by mammals, that being our ears. Despite how reptilian they looked on the outside, like other theriodonts, Gorgonopsids may have possessed an eardrum, since they show a reduction in the connection between the quadrate and pterygoid bones. This is important because in other amniotes, the quadrate is a bone in the upper skull that articulates with the articular and angular bones of the lower jaw. But in mammals, the entire lower jaw is made up of just the dentary, and those other three bones have been reconfigured to make up the middle ear bones. Since Gorgonopsids appear to be going in this direction, even though the eardrum would have been supported by a cartilage or ligaments, it's thought that their hearing was amongst the best in amniotes at the time. But it should be said that an alternative theory for less connectivity of the quadrate is that this instead rotated slightly to provide a wider mouth gape. Now, Gorgonopsids also varied massively in size, with the earlier Gorgonopsids from the Middle Permian being as small as 60 to 70 centimeters, or 2 to 2.3 feet long, and the largest Gorgonopsid known being Enos transuvia, which reached a beastly 3.5 meters or 11 feet long and 300 kilograms or 660 pounds of weight. But given the mammalian heritage, it's important to see where these came about. Traditionally, synapsids were seen as two distinct groups, the primitive pelycosaurs and the more derived therapsids. However, the term pelycosaur has fallen out of favor as a formal term, since it has devolved into a paraphyletic grouping, meaning that it basically means any old synapsid that isn't a therapsid. So these pelycosaurs initially started off as what you would probably mistake for a lizard during the Carboniferous, before growing in size and diversity and gaining dominance at the supercontinent Pangaea during the early Permian. Dominant herbivores had examples such as the Dilophosaurids, and the opposing carnivores had groups such as the Sphenacodontids, of which the most famous member and biggest terrestrial predator of the period was Dimetrodon. The Sphenacodonts are of particular importance, since they're thought to have given rise to the therapsids. And just as the pelycosaurs were losing their grip on the land, the therapsids took over from them during the mid-Permian. The therapsids consisted of four main groups: the Dinocephalians, the Anomodonts, the Biarmosuchians, and Theriodonts, which includes us and our esteemed Gorgonopsids, which appears to have arrived around 265 million years ago. As the Permian became progressively drier and cooler, pelycosaurs struggled as their swampy environments decreased, and the therapsids took the torch as the more adaptable group to this change. Gorgonopsids didn't quite take over straight away, however, since the dominating group at first were the Dinocephalians, which contained a mixture of carnivores and herbivores. But a minor extinction event during the mid-Permian soon wiped this group out, and the two therapsid clades to replace them were the tusked Dicynodonts, taken over the herbivore niches, and taken over the predatory niches with the Gorgonopsids. From here, this group diversified rapidly to fill virtually all of the major terrestrial carnivorous niches, acting as highly active predators at nearly all faunal size scales across much of Pangaea, save for the coldest latitudes, with the majority of Gorgonopsid fossils being found in Africa and Russia. But being an objectively cool animal, unfortunately, doesn't protect you from extinction, which is exactly what the Gorgonopsids suffered, along with a staggering 98% of life on Earth in the Permian-Triassic extinction event, which I go into extensive detail about in my video here. Only 3 clades of synapsids survived into the Triassic, those being the Dicynodonts, with Lystrosaurus being the most common terrestrial vertebrate for the first 30 million years of the Triassic, the Therocephalians, a group that show a clear mid-transition between Gorgonopsids and modern mammals, and finally the Cynodonts, the group that would eventually lead to true mammals. So with their story concluded, I'm now going to answer today's question, which comes from Tonibler SS1VV. Okay. Good day, Mr. Ryan. I hope this comment finds you well. It does, thank you. I hope you're well. If you don't mind, I would like to hear your perspective on why so many species of megafauna around the world have gone extinct, and yet there are still plentiful for today's world in Africa. Or are their numbers in other places higher than I may have realized? Okay, so we are hearing a lot of species becoming endangered or going extinct. Normally various reasons, but it's mostly down to human influence. But yeah, there does seem to be the impression that it's happening at different rates around the world. So how is this if humans are everywhere? Well, when it comes to Africa, you're not wrong in thinking that it's had the lowest loss of megafauna, and there are 2 main reasons for this. The first of this is that hominins initially started out and evolved in Africa. Thanks to this, humans took a very long time to perfect their tendencies, all whilst existing alongside the megafauna that had a chance to adapt to human behaviour, reaching close to somewhat of an equilibrium. When we look across other parts of the world that humans had earlier contact with, such as Eurasia, we see a slightly higher megafaunal extinction rate than Africa, but still relatively lower for the same reason. Contrast this with continents where the megafaunal extinction has been the highest, such as Australasia and the Americas, and these just so happen to be where humans arrived much later, where the animals were not adapted to deal with such efficient predators as humans. The second aspect of this is the level of urbanization and the commercial destruction of natural habitats. With Africa and Asia having the lowest average urbanization rates across the entire continent, more wild areas are left alone for the megafauna to roam around. But Asia does beat Africa slightly with regards to things like deforestation. So with megafauna better adapted for human interaction and less environmental destruction, that does mean that African megafauna have fared much better than in other continents, though they are still in decline. I hope that's a satisfying answer to your question, and if you have a question that you'd like me to answer, be sure to head over to my community tab where you find the relevant post where I'm taking all the questions. I may take a little bit of time to get around to your questions since I only do 1 per video, but I will get around to it as I will with all the questions in that post. Alternatively, you can get a priority spot for answering by signing up to my Patreon, where one of the many benefits you get is the ability to message me your question directly and have me answer it as soon as possible. Other than that, thank you so much for watching this far into the video. Your support really does mean a lot to me, and I look forward to catching you guys next time.